So I want to engage you in a story here, our first story of the day, and I'm going to tell you, engage in about 7 or 8 stories today. This is a story that takes place about 50 years ago, but it's really relevant. Any runners in the room? Any runners? Any runners? Anybody run the 10K the other day? It's a beautiful time of year to go running. Go run. So how many of you have little voices in your head that talk to you? Honestly? Okay, good. Be honest. Sir, do you have little voices? You don't have little voices that speak? I know I've got little voices in my head. We all have little voices in our heads that speak to us. And these voices either propel us forward or they hold us back. They either propel us forward or hold us back. The great Henry Ford said, whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. Right? Whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. Another pretty smart guy named Einstein said we can't solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. In other words, we must change. Here's an interesting fact for you. Did you know that every single cell in our body replenishes itself every 7 years? I just learned that fact about a year ago. That's crazy. What does that mean? That means we got to change, right? We got to change. Einstein is also usually credited with this awesome quote around insanity. I don't know if you can relate to it. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. It ain't going to happen, people. If we do the same thing over and over again, it's going to be the same result. Insanity. Okay, so given that definition, honestly, how many of you have a family member who's completely nuts? Honestly, yeah, me too. For me, it's my Aunt Nancy. She's nuts. Does the same thing over and over again, expects a different result. Okay, I'm going to engage you in a story here. That's a little context. This story takes place over 50 years ago in 1954. Who was alive in 1954? Anybody alive in 1954? In 1954, it was generally believed that it was impossible to run the mile in under 4 minutes. Impossible. It was an impossible barrier, right? Even medical practitioners thought that the human heart would explode if you ran a sub 4 minute mile pace. There was one man who believed that was not the case. His name, Roger Bannister. Perhaps you've heard of him. Roger Bannister was a British runner and a British medical student who at the time woke up one morning and he realized, my God, I'm insane. Why? Because he had been training, going to the track every day, doing the same old, and the best time he had was 4:03. He tried to break the 4 minute mile. He couldn't because he was doing the same thing. So he decided he needed to do something different. So he came up with a different strategy. So on May 6th, 1954, he decided to put that strategy to the test. Now, I'm going to play you this clip, which is really cool. It's the clip of Bannister's mile. Before I do, 2 things you need to know. Number 1, there are 3 people that will break away from the pack, and that's Chris Brasher, Roger Bannister, and Chris Chataway. Chris, Roger, and Chris. You got that? The second thing you need to know is that these 3 runners are running with each other, not against each other. That was part of the strategy. And the voice that you'll hear, in addition to my own as I narrate a little bit, is that of Sir Roger Bannister himself. So let's show you this historic clip from 1954.
As the gun fired, Chris Brasher went into the lead and I slipped in effortlessly behind him, feeling tremendously full of running. My legs seemed to meet no resistance at all, almost as if impelled by an unknown force. We seemed to be going so slowly. Impatiently, I shouted faster, but Brasher kept his head and didn't change the pace.
While the record books show that on this day in 1954, the record was broken by one man, Roger Bannister, make no mistake about it. It was broken by a team. You see, 6 months previous, Bannister had recruited 2 equally talented, motivated runners, Chris Brasher, Chris Chataway, and recruited a tough, demanding coach named Franz Stumpfel, who you'll hear from a little bit later.
I went on worrying about the pace until I heard the first lap time of 57.5 seconds. In the excitement, my knowledge of pace had deserted me. Brasher could have run the first quarter in 55 seconds without my realizing it, because I felt so full of running. But I should have had to pay for it later. Instead, he had made success possible.
That was Brasher and Chataway's job, to make success possible.
1.5 laps, I was still worrying about the pace. A voice shouting, "Relax," penetrated to me above the noise of the crowd. I learned afterwards it was Stamford's.
The coach.
Unconsciously, I obeyed. If the speed was wrong, it was too late to do anything about it. So why worry?
So during the first 2 laps, you hear that Bannister was preoccupied with speed. He didn't trust Brasher. But the real challenge you see here was pace. Brasher had to run fast enough to run under 4 minutes, but not too fast, so that they'd run out of legs.
I barely noticed the half mile passed in 1 minute 58 seconds. I was relaxing so much that my mind seemed almost detached from my body. It was incredible that we could run at this speed without strain. I was barely aware of the fact that Chris Chataway was now going into the lead.
So halfway through the race, Brasher dropped out. His job was done. It was up to Chataway to keep the dream alive. So he was pacing Bannister at this time. And you know, it's tough for us to imagine sacrificing personal ambition for that of a team, but that's exactly what the Chris's did here. But as a storyteller, I look at this a little bit differently. There are only 4 people in history who are able to tell their kids, their grandkids, their family in a pub about this day in history and how they are part of changing the world's view of what a human being is capable of doing. That's a pretty good story, don't you think?
Three-quarters of a mile, the effort was still barely perceptible. The time was 3 minutes 0.7 seconds, and by now the crowd was roaring. A 4-minute mile was possible. Somehow, to do it, I had to run the last lap in 59 seconds. Chataway led round the next bend, and then I pounced past him at the beginning of the back straight, 300 yards from the finish. I had a moment of mixed joy and anguish when my mind took over. It raced well ahead of my body and drew me compellingly forward. I felt that the moment of a lifetime had come.
The moment had come indeed.
Those last few seconds seemed never-ending. A faint line of the finishing tape stood ahead as a haven of peace after the struggle. I leapt at the tape, like a man taking his last spring to save himself from the chasm that threatens to engulf him. My effort was over, and I collapsed almost unconscious with an arm on either side of me. It was only then that the real pain overtook me. I knew I had done it before I even heard the time. I felt as if I was too close to have failed.
Isn't that amazing, eh? Even 50 years later, one of the greatest sporting events in the last 100 years. On May 6, 1954, Roger Bannister, Chris Chataway, and Chris Brasher ran the mile in 3 minutes, 59 seconds, 0.4, breaking the impossible barrier by a mere 0.6 of a second. What's interesting is 6 weeks later, an Australian runner named John Landy then broke the record and ran it in 3:58, 2 months after 4. So, you see, these 3 runners showed the world and runners everywhere what was possible. So, what's our learning from this? What is the mark of Bannister and his team? Because it was indeed a team effort. I think there's several. The first is that psychological barriers are way more powerful than physical ones, aren't they? Psychological barriers, way more powerful than physical ones. As Henry Ford said, whether you think you can or can't, you're right. So I think that's the first lesson. And we all have these voices inside of our heads, and we can either choose to listen to them or choose to move through them. And as leaders, and everyone is a leader in this room, we not only need to pay attention to our voices, but the voices of our team members. Because only then can we really lead, if we understand the voices that are going inside of our team members. So that's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2, clarity of vision, right? It was dead simple. Under 4 minutes, we win. Over 4 minutes or 4 minutes, we lose. Really simple. And I think this is also an amazing example of the 5 levels of leadership that we just looked at, right? Spirit. Let's do something that's never been done before. That's the spirit. The imagination. Let's do a team strategy instead of an individual strategy. the intellect. The plan is that we're going to have a tough coach to train us, and then Brasher, you're going to lead the first 2 laps. Chataway, you're going to lead the 3rd. Bannister, you're our anchor man. So that's the plan. The heart. All 3 were British runners. Let's do this for England. And the hands, let's train and let's execute well on race day. Great example. Despite all that, in terms of the vision and the roles, we hear Bannister questioning the leadership of Brasher, don't we? Whispering in his ear, faster, faster. So he's questioning that. How often does that happen as leaders in your team, where you delegate a task and then you're peering over their shoulder and saying, I wouldn't do it like that. I'm sure that never happens to you. Right? So it's all about team and about empowerment too. I think the greatest lesson of all here is that nothing great was ever done alone. Nothing great was ever done alone. And you got an amazing team here, one team, the CSTS team. So I hope you enjoyed that story. I'm going to come up later and tell you a bunch more stories. But here's the leave I want to leave with you. What's your 4-minute mile for the rest of 2013? What's your 4-minute mile? What's that barrier that you want to break? So I want to come back and I want to explore that with you a little bit later. So I'm going to pass it off to Nyla. Thanks very much. We'll talk to you later.